Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's new social environment. I'm Sophia, and I have the pleasure of being your MC today. I have a few quick notes before we get started. We'll be recording this meeting for the Rail archive. If you would prefer not to be seen, you can disable your camera by pressing the stop video button in the bottom left corner of your screen. We'll keep the audience on mute until question time, which will kick off about halfway through the talk. Please introduce yourself and where you're from in the chat if you'd like to. We'll open that up about 5 or 10 minutes into the talk, and it will also be the place where I collect up questions for the Q&A. And now to introduce our guest for the day. Natalie Baker is an assistant professor of security studies at Sam Houston State University in Texas. She has conducted a number of research projects focused on security issues broadly, ranging from the Ebola scare in the US to the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. Her work rests in the intersection of security, sociology, science, and technology studies, media studies, and critical theory. She has also written an article for this month's Field Notes, focused on COVID-19 in particular. So we're particularly lucky to have her speak with us in this moment. She will be hosted by our very own Field Notes editor, Paul Mattick, who is also the author of numerous books, most recently Business as Usual, The Economic Crisis and the Failure of Capitalism. With that, I will hand over to Paul. Welcome, everyone.
Hi, thank you, Sophia. I'm really happy that we can do this, and I'm very excited to be doing it with Natalie Baker, whom I'm a big fan of. And it's just great that today is the day when the new Rail appeared with your article in it, which I hope everyone will read if they haven't already. So I'd like to start by asking you a question.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, the first question I want to ask is, how are you? You doing okay? Fighting the virus off?
You all, so far so good.
Okay, where are you?
I'm in Austin.
All right.
Pretty close to you, right?
I'm very close to me. We're closer than we've ever been.
I know, right?
So that our physical distancing is decreasing, even though our social distancing is also decreasing. So
I know, right? Yeah.
So when I immediately thought of you when this horrible medical crisis began as the person who should write about it. And when I wrote you, you said, oh, I really want to do that because I've been giving talks on it lately and everybody wants to throw tomatoes at me.
Right.
So I want to start by asking, what did you say that made people want to throw tomatoes at you?
Well, mainly, so when I first started, it was a bit different because this was back in, I think, January, when we really weren't very concerned about it, but there was a little bit of concern, much different than it is now. And my issue with it was, as is my issue still in a different way, was the fear. And that's been a bit of my focus in terms of my research on a lot of things with regard to security, is the issue of fear. And that's, so as a bit of a back step, I did research on Ebola, as was previously mentioned, and Ebola in the United States back in 2014. And I had focused on the media treatment of Ebola and on fear and how media sort of amplified fear about Ebola. And so my issue with the treatment of, and let me discuss the nomenclature of COVID-19. So the name of the virus is actually SARS-CoV-2, right? So that's the name of the virus. The name of the disease is COVID-19. So, and how we talk about it, I like to be precise. So back in that time, I was saying, let's be careful about how we talk about the disease. The case fatality rate is relatively low. We don't know a lot about it. Let's not freak out about it. And people didn't really like that, and they still don't like that today. So that's basically why they were throwing tomatoes at me. And we can talk a little bit about why they might do that. So today, it's a bit complicated, I guess, is the short story. Whoa, I can't.
Oh, sorry.
The audio.
I want to quote something that you say in the article.
Yeah.
You say, we're not using the body of interdisciplinary science to understand how to deal with the virus in a meaningful way. What
Right.
would it mean to use that body of scientific knowledge to deal with the virus in a meaningful way? What's not being done that could be done?
So my quick answer would be sociocultural understandings of why the virus affects people in different ways. And so when you asked me to write this article, I was puzzling over, and this was some time ago, so it seems like years, seems like years ago, right? In the way time's moving. And I was puzzling over why the case fatality rate was so high in Italy versus why it was so low in a place like Korea. And we knew at that time, we kind of knew at that time that the virus was killing older people much more than it was killing younger people. And why in Italy versus South Korea, or why in Italy versus Japan, where Japan has a lot of older people too, and Italy does as well. Well, Italy had something, or Europe, Southern Europe had something called the aging of Europe, where a bunch of older people moved to Southern Europe back in like the early 2000s. So in around 2012, there was an article written in the Gerontologist that said millions of people who were 65 plus were living in Spain and Italy. And so that became one of the reasons why people were dying at higher rates, because there were a lot of older people living in Spain and Italy that then were living in other places in Europe, like Germany, right? So we're not using social science like gerontology or other social sciences to understand why people in New Orleans are dying at higher rates than people in other areas of the country are dying in lesser rates, right? Because why people settle in places, or why aspects like why people who are African American are neglected from the healthcare systems affect why people die from diseases, and that's not something that's really been considered until recently. These are important. These reasons are important.
Yes, like that, especially that last example makes it very clear. I mean, if you think about who lives in New Orleans and how the city is treated and how that particular population has been treated historically, it makes it less mysterious that this is a center of infection and death. So this leads me to another sentence of yours, which I particularly like, and which I think will connect what you were just talking about to the first issue. You say, our dual need for total security and for crisis is much stronger than our relationship with facts. I find that such a fascinating sentence, and I think it's actually the key to your whole article and to your point of view on this. So I'd like you to talk about it a little bit. It's easy to understand why people might feel a need for security, and even for total security, whatever that could possibly mean. But what's interesting is you say that people feel both a need for total security and for crisis. And it's almost like, it seems to me almost as though those two concepts go together, because if what the security you crave is total, then you're constantly going to be facing crisis.
Right.
But why do people need crisis along with security? What do you have in mind when you say that?
Well, I'm still working this out, right? I
was in a lifelong project.
It is. It really is. I was in the middle of writing a paper on Ebola when this new crisis appeared. Writing this paper for years. It's been one of the banes of my existence. And so one of my answers, and it's a need for total security. That'll never happen, right? There's no such thing as total security. And what does that even look like? Like, what would that look like to you?
It seems to me almost meaningless.
Right, it is totally meaningless. So that'll never happen.
Death, I would say. It seems like death. total
Yes,
security.
exactly.
Nothing more can happen. You're
It
completely
seems like
safe.
death, and it is death, and that's the sort of conundrum here, right? Like I mean, death in a sense is total freedom, right? And I'm reading. Are you familiar with the book The Agony of Power?
No.
So I have it right here with me.
Oh God, another one for the gigantic list. Thank you.
So in the introduction, it's not, the introduction is actually not written by Baudrillard. I'm not good at pronouncing French names, but I think I did pretty good with that. And if I didn't, I really don't care. You can make fun of me all you want. So in reference to Hegel, like the master-slave dialectic, right? Mm-hmm. And then Bataille had something to say about that, about the master-slave dialectic. Essentially, the master had power of the slave because the master instilled fear of death. And I'm sorry, my child is microwaving something. So I can instill fear of death to my child to get her to obey me, but that's never going to work. So the master instilled fear of death upon the slave, and to get the slave to do whatever the master wanted, and that was domination. But the master could die too, so that dialectic was problematic, because once the master realized that the master could die too, then that was not true. And so the dialectic essentially was a con game, because the master was also ruled by fear of death. So in a sense, like, death is a freedom. And to go back to your point, all of that's an illusion. And okay, sorry, children. This is the fun times of quarantine. I mean, all of this isn't real. Going back to, sorry, I lost my point. She distracted me. The question was again.
And crisis.
Yeah, total security will never happen. Essentially, the freedom is death. And if you recognize that, if you stop being afraid of death, then you are in that sense, that's freedom. That's being free. So we need this sense of crisis, I think, because ultimately, modern life, we're bored. That's kind of like what I've come to. That's the conclusion of this paper I've been writing, and I haven't really been able to finish this because of this crisis that we're currently in right now, and being sort of sidetracked by the disease of COVID-19, and then this whole issue of sociocultural factors, in which I've been writing a paper right now, which I'm actually in the process of submitting to JAMA, and on a quantitative project, which is not my thing, but this has instituted a whole new existential crisis for me that I'm going through right now. Anyway, that's the answer I have to your question.
Okay.
Boredom. I think that we as a society, as a modern society, we're really, really bored. Maybe that's not the answer you're looking for, but that's the answer I have to provide for you.
I'm looking for your answer, so that's the one I want.
That is my answer.
Well, to go back to the question of security, I have another quotation from you, where you talk about being shocked to a certain extent by people's willingness to forego liberty for the pretense of security, and where you talk about even that what people are giving up their freedom of movement and association for is, as you say, the pretense of security, or the other phrase you use is the performance of safety as opposed to real safety. So I guess another way of tying all of these questions together is why are these abandonments of liberty that people are accepting only a performance of safety? To what extent do you think it's real? To what extent do you think it is an illusory? Why do you think people are so willing to forego liberty? Is it just because they're rational and they believe what the officials tell them? Is that a mistake? What would real security be as opposed to what you're calling the pretense of security?
There's a lot of questions you're asking me.
Sorry.
That's okay.
It's my chance to find out.
Okay, let's start with one. Ask me one and then we'll move. So ask me the most important one because my mind cannot remember all those questions.
To what extent and in what way is the various measures of quarantining, of giving up freedom of movement, freedom of meeting, all of these steps that people are being asked or forced to take by governments at the moment, merely a performance of safety as opposed to actually creating safer conditions?
I don't think we'll know. It's hard to say. It could be that it's really effective. It's kind of like, I liken it to the TSA, right? And the effectiveness of whether or not that actually prevents terroristic acts in airports or in airplanes. It seems like it works. We can study it we can't really study it retrospectively. I'm not sure. It very well could work. It's not going to hurt necessarily to do. It feels like a performance of safety. And again, like I said, it may or may not hurt. The reason why I say it's a performance to some extent is because of this idea that we can control infectious disease. And this is not to say that I'm not suggesting that this applies to like vaccinations or whatever. Vaccinations clearly do work. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I wouldn't say that doesn't work. The larger idea I'm speaking to is that humans believe that we can conquer things like infectious disease, and ultimately we cannot. When we developed vaccinations and conquered diseases like polio and measles, for the most part, chronic diseases became the predominant thing that kills us. And we said, okay, we got this thing under control, right? Then HIV came and bit us in the ass and said, no, not really. You don't have this under control. And then the idea of emerging infectious diseases came about, and then we realized, no, we don't have this under control. And then we realized that the idea of pandemics, or that was an issue that could come back and bite us in the ass. And we started to realize that we needed to prepare for pandemics, and we kind of brushed that aside and said, that could really affect us one day, but we're really not going to worry about it. And then we had issues like SARS, we had issues like H1N1, and realized again, oh, this could be an issue. Then we have this, and we realized, shit, we're kind of screwed. And ultimately, this virus doesn't have a, I mean, relatively speaking, it doesn't have a very high case fatality rate that we know of. In the end, it probably doesn't. It has shut us down for being such a relatively, relatively weak virus. I'm saying that in comparison to something like SARS or something like MERS or HIV or Ebola or whatever. It's highly communicable. That's problematic. But the idea that we as humans can control infectious diseases and we can conquer something like that, that's the illusion I'm talking about, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. I guess what you just said makes me think is that, well, if we as humans were really serious about controlling infectious disease, we wouldn't wait till they, as you put it, bite us in the ass, but we would, for example, reorganize the agricultural system so that we wouldn't be reliant on family farming. We wouldn't be crowding people into cities. We wouldn't be undermining people's health with stress, overwork, chemicals, and pollution. So insofar as nature can be accommodated, it has to be not beaten or conquered.
Exactly.
It has to be accommodated by a rational reorganization of society, and not by locking everybody up. For example, it's actually very interesting that it seems to me that one of the reasons why the rate is so low, fatalities are so low in Germany, it seems, is not only that they tested so many people so that they actually have a better idea what the infection rate is, but also they're Germans. They're very rational and efficient. They sort of test everybody, they quarantine you when you're sick, and they immediately give you medical care. They have enough ventilators, they have enough hospital beds, everybody has medical care, so it's turning out not to be a major problem.
They have a decent healthcare system.
Yeah, so
from the onset.
So it seems like I thought possibly part of what you meant is that instead of having a decent healthcare system, we tell everybody, don't go to the beach. It's true that it's crazy to go to the beach because you will infect everybody that you throw sand at, but that's not a serious way of thinking about this kind of problem.
Exactly.
Which leads me to one more question. Another quotation. We have elevated this virus to an existential threat, to the neglect of what has killed us routinely. Could you say a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, I actually have a lot to say about that. And so I point out in the article. Yeah, I point out in the article, and I mean, this is something I've been saying well before SARS-CoV-2, which is awkward to say. The things that routinely kill us, and I know this, I want to separate this argument from the things that, Trump has said, sort of dismissing the import of the virus, because I'm not saying this isn't important. It is clearly, but these points can exist simultaneously. That heart disease kills 1,800 people in the United States per day, right? That's important. It's important that cancer kills 1,700 people in the United States per day. And it does so every single day, every single year for 60 years plus, right? We don't bat an eye at these statistics. And the question that sort of puzzles me is, why don't we do that? And that question has puzzled me every day, well before this virus, when we have freaked out collectively about this idea of terrorism since 9/11, this idea of, ISIS since 2012, 2014 as an existential threat, when in fact, there has been no coordinated effort by ISIS to attack the United States soil. And since they arose as an existential threat, Ebola in the United States as being an existential threat, when it's ridiculous, it was ridiculously hard to catch when it was positioned as a threat to the United States in 2014. So that is what really, has driven the sort of questions I asked about this virus since it started becoming an everyday topic of news, until now it's become the thing it's become in our everyday life. I mean, that is why I wrote that.
I came across an interesting fact recently, which bears on this question, which I thought I would throw in, and perhaps you would comment on it. Marshall Burke, who's a professor of earth sciences at Stanford, conducted an analysis recently in which he argued that the reduction of air pollution with particulate matter due to the economic shutdown in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic in China alone, and we're just talking about China, saved the lives of 4,000 children and 75,000 elderly people, a topic especially dear to my heart, in 2 months. Which gives you an idea. If you compare that to the death rate. I mean, the death rate, the deaths from COVID-19 are now something like what, 10,000, 20,000? In the last 2 months, 70,000 people who would have been expected to be killed by air pollution in China have been spared because of the cut down, the end of temporary cessation of air pollution.
But it took this to do that.
But it partly explains why it's hard to think, oh, we should do something about cancer or respiratory illness and so forth, because it would mean actually radically altering the whole economic system in order to do that, which, and so from that point of view, COVID is a wonderful experiment in the health conditions that are normal to our society.
Absolutely. But again, like, why is it this that took that, not anything else, right?
That's a very good question.
Not anything else. So, I mean, these are, that to me is just a fascinating question to ask. What is it specifically about this? It's an invisible threat, right? It's something you can't see. But to me, it's also because, at least in the United States, it's foreign, right? And we really we don't like foreign threats at all.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that it's invisible, it can't be seen, is another, is another thing. So to me, the virus is very much like 9/11, except for the fact that it can't be seen and it's everywhere, right? That's especially insidious.
Yes, that actually is certainly part of the explanation, given the peculiar insularity of this nation of immigrants and transnational migration,
right?
Like one of the highest levels in history.
But that's all you need, right?
It's just, it has always been a strange American preoccupation with the foreignness. A preoccupation that began as soon as the native inhabitants had been wiped out. So thank you. I think maybe this would be a good time for people in the waiting room to enter the discussion, or anyone who's on this particular line.
Okay, I can start fielding questions. That sounds great. The first one I'm going to read directly to you by request of Marcia. Natalie has connected the need for crises to a bored society. It seems like you can't know your level of security until you test it, rather like knowing how warm a new jacket is. So is it possible that people need a crisis to, 1, test their level of security, and 2, experience, if they're lucky, the superiority of their security relative to the security of others?
Oh, sure.
Surely the permanently precarious in society don't crave crisis.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's definitely like what they call a breaching experiment. It's classic ethno-methodology for the Garfinkel fans out there.
Could you explain that?
A breaching experiment. It's the sort of, you can't see the norms of society, right, until you kind of break them and make them. So like if I were to break a norm right here, right, we could see those norms in action. If I were just to do something completely bizarre, trying to think what would be totally bizarre right now. Like, I don't know, just name something. Just run around, like, if I were to, I'm trying to think.
So is your idea that that's what the crisis does? Is it breaks the norms and therefore?
Yeah, so it sort of like throws all the routines up into the air and makes things, people are like, I don't know, like, just people need like a sense of order, right? Like that's just well established. Like, we need a sense of order and sort of routine to feel comfortable. It's the idea of ontological security. It's like we need that, and if we don't have it, then everything's just very uncomfortable, and we want to reestablish that. But so the social norms and everything that's sort of within that, we just don't notice it until it's disrupted. And so that's the idea behind a breaching experiment, is kind of like to mess with that. So if like you go into an elevator and you know how elevators are just, you stand in a certain way, and if you kind of mess with that, then people get sort of like, they're like, what's going on? So if you were to mess with that like normal way of acting in an elevator, that's kind of a breaching experiment. Do you see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Just to go back for a moment to the question, which I thought it raised an interesting issue about the difference between people who are already living in a kind of daily crisis and who maybe therefore are not so bored, and people
Sure.
for whom life is relatively stable and predictable, for whom this is a bridging experience and a violent disruption. Could you comment on that?
Well, even
social difference.
Sure. I mean, but even for people whose life is what we would, so if I have a quote unquote normal life where everything is like I do, like my, I have running water, I have food, it's stable, I have an income and all that, that's normal. Even people who don't have that, they still have a sense of normalcy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they have a sense of normalcy, the stability looks different. So what do you mean? Like what's the, so they're like, even they can have a sense of boredom. It just looks different. It looks different for them. I mean,
Awesome.
I guess what's the
Yeah,
question?
Sophia, do we have another question?
We do have some more questions.
I thought
next,
so.
And everyone, please feel free to drop them in the chat as you have them, and I'll call on you sort of roughly in order of which I receive them. So next, I'm going to go to Riley Mang, who's actually one of our wonderful production assistants. Riley, I'm going to unmute you.
Hi, Natalie. Thanks so much for being here, and Paul, thank you as well. My question kind of dovetails off of the last one. I think actually keeping in mind ways in which different people are impacted differently by crisis, but also the opportunity within a crisis to disrupt the boredom of modern life. Is there a way that we can disrupt that boredom without a crisis, which affects people, often the most vulnerable, differently than people who have the power?
Well, I would say we'd have to change society. I mean, I think part of the problem is that okay, I'm going to do this without getting too much into philosophy. I think part of the problem is that we've lost our connection, right? Like, not to go into the whole social distancing thing, but so we've lost our connection to one another. A lot of our modern society is so much built on like work and like going to work and making money, and it's like the whole problem is, I would say, neoliberalism. Like just like the capitalism and making money and all that, and built into like buying stuff and producing stuff and not having meaningful relationships with people. So I think that stems, like, a lot of our issues is just we have no meaning in our life. And again, like this running away, our fear of death, and is part of our sort of slavery in terms of our life. And it's just, if we were to embrace the fact that eventually we're going to die, a lot of our problems would sort of go away. I think that's a simplistic answer, and it's not as simple as that, but it's just, we've lost a lot of a sense of meaning, and a lot of our connection with a lot of with ourselves and our like other people in our relationships with one another, and put it into stuff. And I think that causes a lot of problems. Again, it's a really simplistic answer, which doesn't really get at the root of a lot of the problems that we have. But I think that's a part of the boredom that we face too. That doesn't account for a lot of the marginalization that goes on too, which I think is another huge issue.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks very much. Next, we're going to go to Tom McGlynn. Tom, you very kindly wrote your message, but I'm going to unmute you so we can have your voice in the conversation.
I see the message.
Welcome. Yeah, it's occurred to me during this whole thing that the continual event of the Trump administration has kind of prepped us. It's kind of like a panic administration. And so there's a weird kind of seamlessness to this. I'm not, playing it down in any way, but there's a weird kind of psychological seamlessness going from the suspension of disbelief every day with the Trump administration and the situation which is, impacting people's bodies, obviously, but psychologically, it's probably affecting people, many more people than it's going to affect, physiologically. And I was wondering if you thought about that in terms of like philosophy, in terms of like a panic administration, like how panic is administered.
That's an interesting question. I think, are you talking about in terms of his approach or just the response of us to his administration?
Well, I don't think his is an original, he's not that original in terms of panic administration as a raison d'etre, but his style for sure is kind of very hard.
I just think it's just like whatever.
Yeah, so there's a weird kind of seamlessness to the unmooredness to this situation, So the event, there's like a continual event between that and this. So I'm just wondering if you've given any thought to that, like in terms of events being high or low points, and then just like the whole idea of like a continual event.
It feels like a continual event in general. Like this is just an extension of like just a complete like cluster. Sorry, I use bad language. Clusterfuck of like what, It's a continual crisis, but this is just like hyper continual crisis. The reaction of his administration to this has just been like astoundingly. I can't even get I just can't even. I can't even like. It's like mind-bogglingly. Mind-boggling. It's just so inept.
There's no datum for adequacy at all.
No, it's just it's inept, and I think with any administration it wouldn't have been good because like there's just no preparing for. You can't prepare for this even with all the practice and all that. It's just not possible to prepare for something like this because you can't predict right that this would happen in the way that it did. Of course, like we could have, the biggest problem obviously is in the supply chain in terms of preparing for the sheer amount of people who would overwhelm hospitals with the illness. We could have gotten supplies for that much better than we have. The ineptitude in the administration for dealing with this has been mind-boggling. And I think any administration would have had problems with that, but this has been exacerbated. Just because of the way that it's been dealt with. Yes, clusterfuck. If someone is written, yes, it's a clusterfuck.
I love how you opened your article up with the Thomas Paine quote because, he's basically talking about tyranny, right?
Yes, exactly.
And yeah,
that's exactly what he's talking about.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hard question, hard situation.
Exactly.
But I think a beautiful insight from Tom and builds on what you had written about. So next we're going to go to Jeremy Zillar. Jeremy, I think you have the power to unmute yourself.
So Hey, I was just kind of wondering, as you're talking a lot about social theater and actions people are taking and to the degree to which it helps or whatnot, but it's since we're all in this together, there's this moment where coordinated action is possible, or more likely. Like what is one practical action that people could be taking right now to improve the outcomes of this crisis or create better habits for the future? That your magic wand question. So you can.
Well, I think what we're seeing is, I think one thing is what we always see in disaster type situations. So I've studied disaster a lot, and what I've written about a lot in disasters is what people always do is come together. So you hear, a lot in disasters about chaos and panic, and you've heard a lot about that, I'm sure, in this situation, which isn't true. It's mythology. The whole, like a toilet paper aside, like who really cares about that? People come together and they help one another. So you've heard, like, that's just really what happens, and that's coordinated action, and that's the best we can do. That really is the best we can do. So like the masks and everything, people making masks, and that's a good example. People helping one another in terms of like food delivery, that's happening. Again, that's the best we can hope for in this situation. People helping the medical community, people helping in all sorts of little ways. That's really, again, the best of humanity and human collective action. That's, again, the best we can hope for. It's not, and I think that the worst of it is, and one thing I really hate, and I'm going to say this, is the sort of militarization of terminology and our discussion and our discourse of talking about how we're dealing with this virus is people on the front lines, and not to denigrate that the importance of that response, but it is not a war, right? Like, we are not at war with a virus. This is a natural thing that happens in the world. It's not a war. We're not gonna like vanquish this enemy. I don't like the whole idea of militarizing this. We're not, that's just, it's, anyway. So like, yes, like humans are doing the best they can. And I think I saw someone mention that on the chat, which it's really hard to like navigate the chat and talk at the same time, but people were bringing up what I wrote about. Yeah, I see, like, yes, the myth making, there's a lot of myth making going on in the media, and don't really believe that. So hopefully that answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much. Next, we have a question from John Capetta. John, are you cool to unmute yourself? Cool.
Yeah, I can do that. Natalie, thanks for being here. I was reading the interview you gave in 2018, which was, I think, after Hurricane Harvey. Mm-hmm. And you talked about how the media is often like, there are looters, like there's bad stuff, but like the community is really like usually the first responders, the people that are like,
yes, always
helping their neighbors out.
For the most part, yep.
And obviously people aren't doing like ICU in their garages right now, but are you seeing,
hopefully not.
Hopefully not. Are you seeing similar patterns of response in terms of like mutual aid, or like does this kind of like fit into what you've studied before? And I guess like, are you seeing positive things like that?
Yeah, generally that's, for the most part, the case, because the first responders are always there are only so many, right? So they can only do as much work as one person or a small number of people can do. And you see that in the quote unquote hotspots, right, of the places that are inundated with people who are sick. They can only do as much work as they can do. So the people who have the skills that are necessary in the places where they'll do that work. It's just that's all that can be done. And so Harvey is an example. Of course, natural disaster is different than a virus, but I doubt that people are running ICUs in their garage. But you know, people with those skills that can deal with whatever the situation is that, you know, on hand are going to do what they can do, right? And that's what you're going to see. And you have to remember, so what you're going to see in the news is going to discuss like the worst things possible. So what you're seeing, you know, like body bags here, like people deciding who's going to die, they're going to cover those stories, and that isn't representative of everything that's going on in reality. So like, you just got to be careful about what you read and how you discern that information, because they're going to cover what, you know, the worst things going on. That's just how it goes.
For the headlines.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more going on than just that, right? Like, remember, I always say when I'm teaching my classes, because I talk a lot about the media and myths in my classes in terms of disasters. And I always say we're the media and the media is us. They write these stories because that's what we like to hear, you know? Remember the whole boredom thing? That's part of it. They wouldn't write those stories if we didn't read them. So it's
if I could just add something to that, I thought one of the most interesting examples of mutual aid, and it's like the good version of ICUs in the garage, is those GE workers who said, "Don't fire us, let us make ventilators."
Yeah.
That was an amazing thing, you know. And
because they have the ability.
Here you have people who actually have skills that are not being put to use because GE wasn't interested in making ventilators for some reason. And I think you could even say that all of those Amazon workers and now UPS workers or the postmen in England who went on strike or did sick outs in order to control their own health conditions, this is also mutual aid.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
Let's not forget that aspect of it, which I think has interesting lessons for the future.
Well, I think most people, when given that opportunity, will do so. Like by and large, the majority, you know, the bad apples, if you will, are a minority for the most part. And we forget that. We want to focus on those bad apples, or the stories of horror and apocalypse, if you will. That's what we focus on, but that's not the reality.
Maybe that's what the president is for, is to keep your mind focused on the few bad apples in society.
Sure. Yeah, of course. But again, I mean, and then the media, they want to focus on that too. They want to keep talking about them and talking about them and talking about them without, you know, focusing on the things that really actually matter out there. And I think that's to the detriment of our society. Like, shut up. Like, stop talking about them. I don't want to fucking hear it anymore. I'm sick of it. I turn the news off. You know, I'm a scholar of media in a lot of ways, but I can't listen to it anymore. If you turn it off, you don't give it power anymore. Cut the head off, you know, and it goes away.
I would like to next call on Lauren Bond, if you're comfortable with me unmuting you. I thought you had a great question in the chat. Let me open this up. Lauren, you're unmuted.
Okay, hi.
Hi, welcome.
How are you? How are you,
Hi.
Sophia?
I'm good, thank you. It's great to see you here so often.
Thank you. Oh my God, it's been a lifeline. Thank you guys so much for doing this.
Wonderful. Did you want to mention your comment about, well, really anything, it's your platform, but about the car network? I thought that would be
yeah. I just wondered whether this wouldn't be a great time for the automated car network that's been so much talked about. And there was a wonderful book called Door to Door, which talks about, you know, FedEx and Amazon and thinking about labor. But it seems like with all of the conversation about automated cars, this would be such a great time, even getting people to the hospitals, helping out the, you know, healthcare workers, things like that.
Sure. I mean, at the time of physical distancing, it would be good.
Just wonder how to leverage that possibility, since it's so much a part of consumer culture. I wonder if we all requested that our deliveries pay the driver but not employ them. Get an automated car out there to sort of stimulate the experimentation without anyone losing their jobs right now?
I don't know much about automated cars, so I can't speak to that.
I just always thinking about like what we as consumers can do in this crisis to leverage change. Since our political establishment doesn't know how to move fast enough, and we're all still using our capital to buy things, the question I guess I have is, what is the power of the consumer in this moment of change, and how can we shape our consumption so that the demand for pay for the people who deliver is still there with a shift in their security?
I mean, I think the consumer has a lot of power in this case. It's just a matter of demanding it.
Exactly. So that might be a good actionable step for us all, is to start practicing demanding things when we buy things. In a nice way, of course. I'm just thinking in history about, for example, how the British had a boycott of sugar, and that really altered the conditions for slavery throughout the Americas. So I'm wondering whether there's some kind of strike on consumer products that could bring about a more conscious relationship between consumption, capital, and the world we want to be a part of.
To do a modern day tea party, not like the tea party that we don't like.
Exactly.
Not the tea baggers.
Paul, if you'd like to comment on this, we could open up the discussion further. If not, I certainly feel like this is food for thought for the coming weeks.
Well, I mean, it's an intriguing thought that what if everybody who is now depending on Amazon to deliver everything from groceries to the fabled rolls of toilet paper would refuse to buy anything from Amazon until they provide their workers with health safeguards, sick pay, and big raises. The problem is consumer boycotts generally don't work very well historically. The sugar case is interesting, but that's partly because there was a very large anti-slavery movement already that had been growing for some time. But it's certainly an intriguing set of ideas. The driverless cars is an interesting point that no one is talking about it at all. It's partly probably because there just aren't enough of them. That the number of vehicles necessary for transporting goods is so gigantic that this rather feeble experiment, which hasn't actually gotten very far technically, and the driverless car business probably is actually not workable for these purposes. But it was an interesting idea, and it's fascinating that no one's talking about it, because I think if they had to talk about it, they would have to reveal that it's one of these, like many of the high-tech experiments, it's a kind of Ponzi scheme where you can get people to invest in a technology which doesn't actually come to anything, but in the meantime, the tech companies have made out like bandits.
Well, I have to sort of check up on my the book that was my reference. It's called Door to Door, and it was really helpful. But my understanding was that there are fleets of driverless cars in smaller cities like Austin that Uber is even working with, and they weren't. There was a lot of fear about using them because people were very used to driving ourselves. But I think that now that there's so much fewer people on the road, it might be worth, it just in terms of what can we do to activate a better living condition, it might be worth thinking about just asking for that, en masse.
Also, the last thing we need is more cars. I mean, this is a time when we really should be thinking seriously about moving away from fossil fuels. One of the reasons that you can breathe more freely in Los Angeles is that there are no cars. So whether they're self-driving or driven by people, they're still cars. And even if they're electric cars, the electricity is still generated by coal and natural gas. So
I think we're
cars is not the solution to our social problems.
Yes, well, I disagree with that based on the fact that the infrastructure of the highway is probably the most significant built ruin that we've accomplished in the 20th and 21st century, and that those highways are going to need to be purposed because we're not going to be able to afford completely rebuilding infrastructure. So even as a short-term solution, I think non-fossil fuel-based cars are the way to go.
Awesome. I mean, this is a place for disagreement as well as community. So I love to hear the back and forth and the debate. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your perspective, Lauren. We hope to see you more days, every day.
You will.
And Lauren will also be joining us as a guest in the coming weeks. So that's exciting news. More on that later. For now, I would like to thank Paul and Natalie and all of our guests and attendees here for an invigorating conversation, and move to our rail tradition, which is ending lunch with a poem.
Today, I first thank you for having done such a wonderful job as hosting.
Oh, thank you very much. This is the highlight of my day every day. Yeah, special shout out to my family who tuned in today in the background. And now over to Nick Bennett, who is our poet for the day. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I also just want to thank Paul, Natalie, and everyone and all of our regular visitors to thank you for joining us. So I noticed, even though my background is a Goya painting that is part of the death and disaster sort of topic, I am going to read a light poem. I noticed today was William Wordsworth's, well, he was born on this day in 1770, so I'm going to read a poem by William Wordsworth. The title is I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. Beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in a sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft, when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. So, a turn on the pleasure of solitude as we're all in quarantine.
Oh, thank you so much. And with that, we will end our lunchtime talk. Tomorrow we'll be joined by Anne Lauterbach. I just dropped the link into the chat if anyone would like to sign up. And otherwise, I hope everyone has a wonderful Tuesday.